Before she became the face of the French New Wave, before she appeared on cinema screens around the world, and before her life became entangled with politics, controversy, and tragedy, Jean Seberg was simply a teenager growing up in the American Midwest. She was born in 1938 in Marshalltown, Iowa, a small city surrounded by farmland and far removed from the glamour of Hollywood. Her father worked as a pharmacist and her mother was a teacher. By all accounts, her upbringing was stable and conventional. There was little to suggest that she would one day become one of the most recognizable figures in international cinema. Like many future actors, she developed an interest in performance through school and local theatre productions. She was intelligent, ambitious, and willing to place herself in front of an audience. Yet there was nothing inevitable about the path she would eventually follow. The distance between Marshalltown and Hollywood was measured in more than miles. In the 1950s, the film industry remained one of the most exclusive worlds in America. Thousands dreamed of becoming movie stars. Very few ever came close. The traditional route involved years of training, networking, minor roles, and a great deal of luck. Jean Seberg's story would unfold very differently. In 1956, acclaimed director Otto Preminger began searching for an actress to play Joan of Arc in his forthcoming production of St. Joan, based on the play by George Bernard Shaw. The search became a publicity event in its own right. Thousands of young women were considered for the role. Newspapers followed the process closely. The hunt for a new face generated enormous attention, creating the impression that anyone from anywhere might suddenly be transformed into a movie star. Against extraordinary odds, the unknown teenager from Iowa was selected. Almost overnight, Jean Seberg went from relative anonymity to national headlines. It was the kind of discovery story that Hollywood loved to tell. A young woman from a small American town is chosen from thousands of hopefuls and handed a leading role in a major motion picture. The narrative seemed ready-made for magazine articles and publicity campaigns. Audiences were encouraged to see Seberg as the latest dream come true. Yet the reality was far more complicated. The role of Joan of Arc was not an easy introduction to filmmaking. It required an inexperienced actress to carry a major production under the supervision of a demanding and highly visible director. Most performers spend years learning their craft before finding themselves at the centre of such attention. Jean Seberg was being asked to do it immediately. The pressure was immense. Every aspect of her appearance, performance, and personality attracted scrutiny. Journalists wanted to know who she was. Critics debated whether she had been chosen correctly. Hollywood watched closely to see whether the gamble would succeed. For a teenager who had recently been living a relatively ordinary life in Iowa, the transition was extraordinary. It also marked the beginning of a pattern that would follow Seberg throughout much of her career. Again and again, she would find herself transformed into a symbol. At first, she became the symbol of Hollywood discovery, the fresh face plucked from obscurity and presented to the world as a future star. But symbols can be difficult things to live up to, and as Jean Seberg was about to discover, becoming famous was far easier than finding a place within the industry that had made her famous. When Jean Seberg was chosen to play Joan of Arc, Hollywood presented the decision as the discovery of a new star. It was a familiar story. The film industry had always loved tales of unknown young women suddenly elevated to fame. Such stories reinforced the idea that Hollywood was a dream factory, capable of transforming ordinary lives into extraordinary ones. For Jean Seberg, however, the reality proved far more difficult. The production of St. Joan placed her under intense scrutiny before audiences had even seen her perform. Newspapers followed her progress. Publicity departments promoted her as a major new talent. Expectations rose steadily as the film moved towards release. Few young actors had begun their careers under such circumstances. Most are allowed to make mistakes in relative obscurity. Seberg was expected to learn her craft while carrying the weight of a major international production. The film was released in 1957. Unfortunately, the reception was disappointing. Critics were divided, and many focused their attention on Seberg herself. Some believed she lacked the experience necessary for such a demanding role. Others questioned whether she should ever have been cast in the first place. Instead of celebrating the arrival of a new star, sections of the press treated her as evidence of a failed experiment. The criticism was often harsh. What made the situation particularly difficult was that Seberg had not spent years building a career that could absorb a setback. She had gone almost immediately from obscurity to public judgment. The same publicity machine that had elevated her now seemed eager to evaluate whether she had justified the attention. For many young performances, such an experience might have ended a career before it had truly begun. Yet director Otto Preminger remained convinced of her potential. He cast her again, this time in Bonjour Tristesse, an adaptation of the celebrated novel by François Sagan. Once more, Seberg found herself working in a high-profile production under the direction of the man who had discovered her. The film received a more positive reception than St. Joan, and Seberg's performance attracted a warmer response. Yet the experience did not entirely solve her problems. By the late 1950s, Hollywood was struggling to define exactly what kind of actress Jean Seberg should be. She did not fit comfortably into the mould of a traditional studio star. She lacked the polished glamour associated with many leading ladies of the period. At the time, she possessed a naturalness and modernity that seemed slightly out of step with Hollywood's established expectations. The industry had discovered her. What it had not done was decide how to use her. This left Seberg in an uncertain position. She was famous, recognisable, and widely discussed, yet she remained professionally unsettled. The promise that had surrounded her discovery had not translated into a secure place within the American film industry. In retrospect, this period is often overshadowed by what came later. When people think of Jean Seberg today, they tend to picture a young woman walking through the streets of Paris, selling newspapers and speaking directly to a generation of filmgoers that wanted something different from traditional cinema. But that future was not yet visible. At the end of the 1950s, Jean Seberg remained caught between expectation and reality. Hollywood had tried to create a star, but the result was uncertain. Ironically, the industry that had discovered her would not be the one that made her immortal. That would happen elsewhere, across the Atlantic, in a city that was becoming the centre of a cinematic revolution. If Jean Seberg's story had ended with Hollywood, she would have been the young actress discovered by Otto Preminger, the star who arrived with enormous publicity but never quite fulfilled the expectations that surrounded her debut. But instead, her career took an unexpected turn. The place where Jean Seberg truly became a cinematic icon was not Hollywood, but Paris. By the end of the 1950s, a new generation of filmmakers was beginning to challenge established ideas about cinema. In France, critics and directors associated with a publication called Cahiers du Cinéma were questioning everything from storytelling conventions to production methods. They admired American films, but they also believed cinema could be more personal, more immediate, and more adventurous than the mainstream industry often allowed. Among them was a young filmmaker named Jean-Luc Godard. At the time, Godard was largely unknown as a director. That would soon change. His first feature film, A Bout de Soufflé, known in the USA as Breathless, would become one of the defining works of the French New Wave, and one of the most influential films ever made. At its centre was Jean Seberg. She played Patricia Franchini, an American student living in Paris who becomes involved with a small-time criminal played by Jean-Paul Belmondo. On paper, the story sounds relatively straightforward. On screen, however, it felt entirely different from much of the cinema audiences were accustomed to seeing. Godard shot on real streets, rather than relying heavily on studio sets. The film embraced spontaneity, unconventional editing, and a sense of freedom that challenged traditional filmmaking techniques. Characters talked, wandered, flirted, and argued in ways that often felt unpredictable and natural. Jean Seberg proved perfectly suited to this approach. What Hollywood had sometimes regarded as uncertainty or awkwardness became an asset. Her natural manner, her intelligence, and her modern appearance helped create a character who felt entirely believable. She did not seem like a carefully manufactured movie star. She seemed like a real person. The image became iconic. The cropped hair, the striped shirt, the copy of the New York Herald Tribune tucked beneath her arm. Decades later, those images remain inseparable from both Jean Seberg and the French New Wave itself. For many viewers, Breathless was their first encounter with a different kind of cinema. The film helped demonstrate that movies did not need to follow established rules. Directors around the world would study its techniques and borrow its ideas. Its influence extended far beyond France. And with every passing year, Jean Seberg's place within it became more secure. The irony was remarkable. Hollywood had spent years trying to turn her into a star and had never quite succeeded. Yet a low-budget French film achieved something far more significant. It transformed her into a symbol of a new cinematic movement. For the first time in her career, Seberg appeared to have found a creative environment that understood her strengths. The fresh-faced young woman from Iowa had become an international figure. But success brought new complications. As her reputation grew, so did the challenge of defining who she was and where she belonged. Was she an American actress, a European film star, a symbol of modern cinema, or something else entirely? Those questions would shape the next chapter of her life, because after Breathless, Jean Seberg found herself living between worlds, admired by many, but never fully at home in any of them. The success of Breathless changed Jean Seberg's career forever. It also created a problem. The film had made her famous, but it had not given her a clear place within the international film industry. Instead, Seberg found herself caught between different worlds, each seeing her in a slightly different way. To many American audiences, she remained the young actress discovered by Otto Preminger. To European audiences, she had become one of the faces of a new cinematic movement. Neither image fully captured who she was, and neither offered an obvious path forward. Throughout the 1960s, Seberg worked steadily in both Europe and the United States. She appeared in a variety of productions, moving between commercial films and more ambitious projects. On paper, this should have been the most successful period of her career, yet there was often a sense that she existed slightly outside the mainstream. Hollywood had never completely embraced her. The French New Wave admired her, but she was not French. She was an American who had become famous through a European film movement. That unusual position made her distinctive, but it could also leave her professionally isolated. Unlike some stars who became strongly associated with a particular genre or screen persona, Seberg resisted easy categorization. She could appear vulnerable, intelligent, detached, or emotionally direct. Her performances often carried a sense of independence that audiences found compelling, but which did not always neatly fit into the expectations of producers and studios. Away from the screen, her life became increasingly international. She lived and worked in different countries, travelled extensively, and moved within artistic and intellectual circles that extended far beyond the film industry. The world she inhabited was very different from the small-town Iowa of her childhood. At the same time, the decade itself was changing. The 1960s were marked by social upheaval, political activism, and growing debates about race, war, and civil rights. Across Europe and America, many artists and public figures felt compelled to take positions on issues that earlier generations might have avoided. Jean Seberg was one of them. Unlike some celebrities who kept politics at a distance, she became increasingly interested in social causes and political engagement. She contributed money to civil rights organisations and supported groups working for social change. Friends and colleagues often described her as someone who was genuinely concerned about injustice rather than merely seeking publicity. At first, these activities attracted relatively little attention. Many actors supported charitable causes or expressed political opinions. There was no reason to imagine that Seberg's involvement would become one of the defining aspects of her life. Yet the political climate of the late 1960s was becoming more confrontational. Government agencies, law enforcement organisations, and political groups were increasingly suspicious of one another. Activists found themselves under greater scrutiny. Public figures who associated with controversial causes sometimes discovered that their actions carried consequences they had never anticipated. For Jean Seberg, those consequences would prove profound. The actress, who had spent much of her career searching for a place between Hollywood and Europe, was about to find herself at the centre of a very different kind of story, one that had little to do with cinema, and one that would cast a shadow over the rest of her life. By the end of the 1960s, Jean Seberg was known not only as an actress, but also a public supporter of social and political causes. She had donated money to civil rights organisations, Native American groups, and various campaigns for social change. Among the organisations she supported was the Black Panther Party, a controversial movement that attracted both admiration and hostility in equal measure. To Seberg, these activities appear to have been motivated by conviction. Friends and colleagues frequently described her as someone who believed that success carried responsibilities beyond personal advancement. She was not simply lending her name to causes, she was offering practical support. Unfortunately, she had become politically active at a moment when the American government was treating certain forms of activism with growing suspicion. The late 1960s and early 1970s saw the expansion of surveillance programs aimed at monitoring groups and individuals considered politically disruptive. The most infamous of these was the FBI's COINTELPRO operation, which targeted a wide range of organisations and activists across the political spectrum. Jean Seberg found herself drawn into that world. FBI files later revealed the Bureau had monitored her activities and regarded her support for radical causes as a matter of concern. What followed remains one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of celebrity and political surveillance. In 1970, false information concerning Seberg's private life was leaked to members of the press. The allegation was deeply personal and designed to cause maximum embarrassment. Although the story was untrue, it quickly spread through newspapers and gossip columns. The fact that it was false did little to reduce the damage. For Seberg, the consequences were devastating. She was pregnant at the time. Friends later described the emotional toll the publicity took upon her. The intrusion into her private life was profound, transforming personal matters into public spectacle. The incident became one of the most widely discussed aspects of her life, but it was only part of a larger pattern. Throughout the 1970s, Seberg struggled with increasing emotional and psychological pressures. Her career no longer occupied the position it once had. Professional disappointments, personal difficulties, and constant public attention combined to create an increasingly difficult situation. It would be simplistic to attribute every problem she faced to government surveillance. Human lives are rarely explained by a single cause. Relationships, careers, finances, health, and personal circumstances all played their part. Yet it is equally difficult to ignore the effect of sustained scrutiny and public humiliation. For years, Seberg had lived under the gaze of others. First as the small-town teenager transformed into a Hollywood discovery, then as the face of the French New Wave, then as a politically engaged public figure. At each stage, people projected ideas onto her. She became a symbol, a headline, or a controversy. The actual person often seemed to disappear behind the image. By the end of the decade, the pressures had become overwhelming. In 1979, Jean Seberg died in Paris at the age of 40. The news shocked many who remembered the vibrant young actress who had represented the future of internet. The news shocked many who remembered the vibrant young actress who had once represented the future of international cinema. The circumstances of her death prompted renewed discussion about the treatment she had received during her life and the forces that had shaped her final years. What remained beyond dispute was the sense of loss. Not simply the loss of an actress, but of a life whose possibilities had once seemed limitless. Yet even as debates continued about politics, surveillance, and responsibility, another question began to emerge. How should Jean Seberg be remembered? As a victim of circumstance, as a political figure, or as one of the most important screen presences of our generation? That question would shape the final chapter of her story. So how should Jean Seberg be remembered? It is a surprisingly difficult question to answer. For some people, her name is forever linked to the controversy that surrounded her final years. Others remember her as a victim of political surveillance and media intrusion. Others remember her as a victim of political surveillance and media intrusion. Still others know her primarily through the tragic circumstances of her death. Yet if Jean Seberg is remembered only through those events, something important is lost. Before she became a symbol of political controversy, she had already become a symbol of cinematic change. The image most closely associated with Seberg is not a newspaper headline or an FBI file. It is the young woman walking through the streets of Paris in Breathless, selling copies of the New York Herald Tribune and embodying a new kind of cinema. More than 60 years after its release, Breathless remains one of the most influential films ever made. Its style, editing, and approach to storytelling helped reshape the language of modern filmmaking. Directors around the world continue to study it, while audiences continue to discover it. At the centre of that film is Jean Seberg. What makes her performance so enduring is its apparent simplicity. Unlike many stars, Seberg rarely seemed interested in projecting glamour or authority. Instead, she brought an unusual naturalness to the screen. Her characters often felt like real people, rather than carefully constructed movie personalities. That quality helped make her an ideal figure for a generation of filmmakers seeking greater realism and spontaneity. In many ways, she represented a bridge between different cinematic traditions. She emerged from Hollywood, but she never became fully defined by it. She achieved her greatest success in Europe while remaining unmistakably American. She belonged to the French New Wave without ever truly being part of the French film establishment. That position between worlds made her difficult to categorize during her lifetime. Today, it makes her fascinating. Modern audiences often encounter Seberg through film history. They discover her as part of the story of the French New Wave, yet many are struck by something more immediate. She feels contemporary. The cropped hair, the direct manner, the sense of independence and self-possession. Much like certain performers from earlier generations who seem to transcend their own era, Seberg appears surprisingly modern. That quality has helped preserve her place in cinema history. At the same time, her life continues to provoke discussion beyond film itself. Questions about privacy, media responsibility, political surveillance, and the treatment of public figures remain relevant today. The issues that touched her life have hardly disappeared. As a result, Jean Seberg occupies a unique place in cultural history. She is remembered not only for the films she made, but also for the wider forces that shaped her life. Few actors become associated with both a major artistic movement and a significant political controversy. Seberg became part of both stories. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about her legacy is that neither has completely overshadowed the other. The political story remains important. The personal tragedy remains impossible to ignore. But the films endure. And every time a new viewer discovers Breathless, Jean Seberg once again becomes what she first set out to be all those years ago. Not a symbol, not a headline, not a controversy. An actress, a performer whose work still speaks across the decades, and whose place in film history remains secure.